Since early in my term, our efforts in space have been under review. With the advice of the Vice President, who is Chairman of the National Space Council, we have examined where we are strong and where we are not, where we may succeed and where we may not. Now it is time to take longer strides, time for a great new American enterprise, time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth.
On May 25, 1961, President Kennedy made a declaration that would change the course of the Cold War. He came before Congress, declaring that the United States will go for the moon, and proposed a budget to give NASA the money it needed to compete with the Russians. This speech was the turning point that gave NASA the resources it needed to win the space race, and in effect created a long-lasting impact on American culture. Kennedy's decision to increase funding for NASA was influenced by the moderate actions of the Eisenhower administration in response to the Soviet space program's advancements. In 1957, Russia launched Sputnik, the first man-made satellite into space. The Russian news network, TASS, announced the launch of Sputnik and declared it a huge success for the new socialist society. But Eisenhower was not willing to take extreme action in response to Sputnik.
Very little value in human spaceflight and no value in racing Russia.
His idea was not to send a message to the world, but only to research and build technologies that would immediately benefit America.
So the first thing that Eisenhower did when somebody told him, well, if you orbit a satellite with a camera, you can see what's going on in the Soviet Union, he said almost immediately, let's do that.
Eisenhower stressed how what he was doing was not to compete with Russia. From the memorandum of a meeting Eisenhower held with his space committee,
it was better to have the Earth satellite proceed separate from military development to stress the peaceful character of the effort.
Although the military had stated it could produce a satellite of its own in under 4 years, Eisenhower desired to avoid competition. This limited the growth of the American space program by not giving it the resources and funding it needed. NASA's situation did not change immediately when Kennedy took office. Kennedy was apprehensive about going to space, but the person that pushed him the most to go down this route was his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, who desired a strong space program and heavy competition with Russia. He saw it as an opportunity to send America decades ahead technologically, as well as inspire the American public. However, they had a huge task of not only convincing the entirety of Congress, but all of America to see the benefits of this costly race. Although Kennedy had given NASA more funding than it ever had before, NASA did not have much to show for it. But the spark of hope, Project Mercury, was a plan to launch Alan Shepard into space, before the Russians could launch a man of their own. Scheduled for May 5, 1961, the event was highly anticipated by the American people. However, only a month before its scheduled launch, the Russians launched Yuri Gagarin into space before Alan Shepard because of delays with Project Mercury. However, this was not a loss for America.
The success of Project Mercury demonstrated the capability to launch reliable vehicles and demonstrated the capability of individuals to perform under these unusual conditions.
This showed that America was only a month away from the Soviets technologically.
They began the final 5-hour countdown, but the tricky weather nearly forced the shop to be scrubbed again. Deep gloom turned to nervousness and finally to optimism as the weather cleared. There were doubts. If the missile had blown up, if anything had happened to Alan Shepard, there's no telling what the effect would have been on our prestige or our space program. But nothing went wrong. Everything went well.
With NASA's recent success, Kennedy decided now was the time to commit America to the moon. But going to the moon was not his first option.
Well, he tried to find other things to do. Going to the moon was not his first choice. He told his science advisor if we had something on Earth that would produce the impression of Soviet success and Soviet power because of Gagarin, we would do it. But we can't find anything on Earth that would produce that effect, so we have to do something in space.
At the time, the moon was beyond the reach of humans, and if America could conquer this uncharted domain, it would send a message to the world that America was an unstoppable force, both in military strength and technological advancements. Lyndon Johnson even said himself,
"Control of space means control of the world."
Only 20 days after the success of Shepard, Kennedy declared to Congress that America would go to the moon.
I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I had earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
Project Mercury caused Kennedy's promise of putting a man on the moon, the turning point towards space. Kennedy was looking for something to win over the Russians long before Shepard. From a memo he sent to Johnson, he asked,
"Do we have a chance of beating the Soviets by rocket to go to the moon and back with a man?"
Shepard was just an opening to make this declaration. He asked Congress for the funding for NASA to be increased by $4.5 billion over a 5-year period. His plan passed almost unanimously. This totaled to NASA spending $6 billion a year at the peak of this 5-year period, which was 4.5% of the federal budget, the most NASA had ever received. Kennedy and Johnson were intent on turning this small government agency into a key factor in the Cold War. Even after Kennedy's death, the effects of his promise showed at every step towards the moon. The Gemini program was a big event that utilized the funding that Kennedy's speech gave to NASA. It showed America and the world what NASA could achieve by sending astronauts into orbit to test the effects of zero gravity on the human body. Gemini 4 was an especially important part of this process, for it was televised to an international audience. America now had 2 new heroes to idolize, and the epic accomplishments of NASA were seen all over the world.
Overall, I think the media managing of the American space program was a key factor in a very generally positive impression. If you look at Gemini astronauts touring the world, like in South America, in Bolivia, and places like that, and the crowds just came out and greeted these astronauts. It's amazing to see, and I think that had a very positive impact.
An entire generation of American students benefited from grants put in place because of Kennedy's speech. The idea of space exploration caused the youth of America to aspire to become scientists or engineers. Innovation is an integral part of the American culture, and these grants encouraged high school and college students to move into these fields. $1.2 billion was given to the construction of classrooms and laboratories, and grants were given to aid the scientists of the future.